Last week, we ended with a question that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. If you've spent years, maybe decades, using the same coping strategies, at what point do they stop feeling like something you do and start feeling like who you are? Because if you've always been the peacekeeper, the funny one, or the people pleaser, or the person who's always waiting for the other shoe to drop, how would you even know where your personality ends and your survival begins?
And I think that a lot of people get stuck there, right? Because if it's something that has been true for as long as you can remember, it doesn't feel like behavior anymore. It just feels like that becomes your identity. And you stop saying, this is something I've learned. And you really start saying, this is just who I am.
But what if that's not true? What if some of the things we've accepted as permanent parts of ourselves are actually incredibly intelligent adaptations? And if they were learned, does that mean they can also be unlearned? Today, I want to explore one of the biggest questions in psychology. Can people actually change? Or do we simply become better versions of who we've always been?
Back to the existential couch. I'm Brian.
And I'm Wendy. Every week, we sit down to explore one of life's biggest questions through psychology, philosophy, lived experience, and honest conversation. We don't claim to have all the answers. We're simply curious enough to keep asking better questions.
And if this is your first time joining us, this is actually part two of this conversation, which we started last week. In part one, we explored why knowing better doesn't automatically lead to doing better. And we talked about how brains prioritize survival over comfort. Why familiarity often feels safer than change, and how our nervous systems learn patterns long before we're aware of them.
Which brings us to where we left off. If our brains learn survival strategies and we repeat them over and over, when do those strategies stop feeling temporary and become the stories we tell ourselves about who we are? Because I think that's where healing starts, not with changing who you are, but with asking whether the person you think you are is the whole story.
So with that, let's get back to the couch. Last week, we ended with the idea that our survival strategies can eventually start feeling like our own personality. And it really got me to thinking about one psychologist who spent a lot of time asking a very similar question, Carl Jung. He believed we all develop something called a persona. So not a fake self, social self. It's a version of us that really learns how to fit into the world. And I think that's actually a really interesting place for us to kick back off and restart.
Yeah, I mean, as kids, we're constantly gathering information. What gets me praised? What gets me in trouble? What makes people laugh? What makes people pull away? And over time, we naturally adapt, not because we're dishonest, but because we want connection, belonging, and safety.
With that, it's not that the persona is necessarily an unhealthy thing, right? Like most of us speak differently with our boss and with our best friends, or friend group versus workplace, or even home. With your kids, those type of things. That's all
Mhm.
very normal. And I think the question that he asked was, "Do you have a persona?" Or it wasn't really that. Do you have a persona? But really, have you forgotten it's only one part of you?
I love I love thinking about this because it changes the question. Instead of asking who am I, it asks who did I learn to become?
Exactly. And it wasn't. Because it's not about the whole theory, not theory, but the whole idea of persona that was brought to the table wasn't that he was trying to tell people that we're fake. Like, you're not fake for having a persona. That's
Mhm.
not the concept of it, right? It was, he invited us to wonder whether some of those traits we call our personality actually started as adaptation. Like you brought up earlier in the open, like, that being funny, always being the responsible one, never asking for help, like we talked about so many times,
Mhm.
or always being the person to keep peace. Those are adaptations and almost survival methods versus this fake idea. So, and it's one of those, I think that obviously kind of ties into almost where people get that kind of conflicted with the idea of masking at the same.
Yeah. So I think the most interesting question isn't whether really Young is right. It's this: how much of my personality reflects who I truly am, and how much reflects what helped me belong? So, what's your
Yeah,
first?
I think that
Yeah.
ties. Yeah, that question, so I obviously tied it back into masking, but that direct question is very much kind of, it makes me want to ask, what's your first? Obviously, I've already kind of given my reaction to tying that into masking, but What is your first reaction to that idea, his idea of the persona?
I think there's a line between adapting and masking when it comes to the persona. They are slightly different. Like if you're looking at it from like the autistic masking standpoint versus what he meant by persona. So I think when you're looking at like how you behave at work versus home, are you really hiding yourself or are you just different versions of yourself in different places? And I think that's different than feeling like you have to act like a different person or a place so people will get along or to make social situations easier. Because I think we all have our work self, our home self, our maybe your church self if you go to church or like there's different versions of us or personas.
Yeah, and it also, I think that's also where it comes in the idea that like adaptation isn't necessarily masking. I think obviously when we talk about masking, it's really letting yourself, your personality, and who you are at your core kind of change to adapt to traumas or your environment and those types of things, and almost letting yourself become someone else. Where in this case, we're really focusing on adaptation as more of, I don't even know if it's really a survival thing, but it's still you. It's who you are, still your personality. You're just understanding that there is a cultural contract almost to behaviors and the way behavior is reflected in different areas. Like you brought up church, or whether you're going to a temple, a spiritual place, you're there for the purpose of worship. In most cases, that's the point of it, right?
Hmm.
You're not necessarily there, well, according to most scriptures and ideologies. If you're there, you're not doing it for yourself. You're doing it for the worship. Like that's the act. So your behavior is going to be a little bit different because you're kind of stepping away from yourself. Having to kind of be friendly and you're loving dad mode at home. And if you have to go into kind of stricter mode, like there has to be able to have that switch in your behavior and how you're approaching, talking to different types of people in different situations.
Do you think persona can be affected by things like hypervigilance and intuition? Like, if you were always the easier, low maintenance person trying to avoid conflict, do you think that can reflect patterns in our personas? Like, which would be a
Yeah.
similar,
Well, yeah, because I think the
different than autistic masking, but I think we have behaviors that show up in our personas.
for sure, I think that's definitely part of it, and then there may be some similarities, right,
Hmm.
to our persona shifts and the mask that we put on, because maybe one of those personas is what becomes the mask, right? Like it
Yeah.
takes over the personality more than just being that specified persona. It becomes more of who you are, and you kind of let that take over. So maybe in some people, that the workaholic in me had the tendency to really kind of high function, all energy, all of my existence and power goes into work, and keeping that method and that persona and how I'm approaching people, and whether, letting kindness become being just too nice and those types of things, and whether being friendly with customers or patients, or, all of these different things that you no longer, you don't have the energy to give back to your friends and to your external life outside of that place. So that persona then kind of shifts over and the frustration grows, and you're not being kind of who you want to be, and you don't have that power to do so. Do you think that authenticity means being the same person everywhere? Or do you think that the persona is still authentic, but can become the mask if you let it?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that you can be authentic yourself in different situations because how we show up in different situations is always going to look different and that can be
Mhm.
authentic. And then
Yeah.
then we look at, masking. That's where it's a little less authentic and it becomes more of like, I need to act this way for people to like me or to get along in this social situation and you can almost lose your identity a little bit with masking. Whereas with persona, you're being authentic and being yourself.
I think that's actually a really great way to put it. So, in your authentic self, what is a personality trait that you're most proud of?
I think I'm Wow, most I don't know what I'm most proud of. I think I'm proud of the fact that when I was diagnosed as autistic at 31, I learned a lot about what masking was and how much I was doing that. And I think it's learning to step into authenticity in these different scenarios has become the personality trait that I am probably most proud of is my authenticity and being transparent and being myself and not pretending to make other people happy. And I think I can still have pieces of what I used to mask in those scenarios and still be authentic because you gotta have it's social skills to a point, but that's more with the masking versus just how you authentically show up in a situation. So I wanted to ask you, Brian, do you think if everyone else's expectations were removed, what parts of you would still be there?
Yeah, I think that's something that I've really I think I've thought about without knowing those are like the exact words. Like I didn't have the frame of thought to be able to pose that question to myself. But yeah, I think the adaptation part would still be there. I think my joy of storytelling, for example, would still be there. If no one expected me to tell stories or to have conversations or to want to put them on paper or to hear others, right? Like I think that that would still be a very big part of me, and I think that what that actually translates to is like a certain allowance of vulnerability to want to learn and empathize more with people. I think I do that most by even in cultures, like looking at the stories they've told through time and the things they've left behind, whether it's passed by word or finally written down in those things. And I think, yeah, I think the other thing that would be left of me would be what it comes down to at the end of the day is that and just my family. Like even wanting to be around them, even though there's not the expectation for me to do
Mhm.
anything on a day or even from the kids, like they're cool just chilling and hanging out. Like they just want to be around. So when you actually see that and you recognize it in the people that are closest to you that truly care about you, it's easy for me to just kind of step back and exist. And if people like that and accept it, then cool. If not, I'm still going to sit there. Like I could sit here and talk to an empty screen or no audience and still tell a story. And if it does reach one person and it just kind of clicks, then awesome, that's been shared. Or if I get the chance to hear theirs, even better.
I love that.
And I
I
think,
think another thing
yeah, and I
that
think
I
that
was
comes with, yeah, I was
no,
just going
what
to
were
say
you
that comes with the creativity in general, as far as not needing an audience to want to be there. Like if it grows and we can share with more and more people and we build a community, like same thing we've talked about before with the point of even doing this, it matches why I want to get into the other spaces, whether it's actual plays or audio dramas or anything like that. Is it's not to just amass this wide fortune or audience. It's just even if it's a few people that really engage with it and care, then and that's the expectation, only expectation between anyone involved, then that would still be the purpose. I think that's what sticks out most for me.
Yeah, so I think basically we're saying everyone adapts to some degree. Adaptation is definitely not the same thing as being fake. Our identities are shaped by both temperament and experience. And I think the interesting question isn't whether we have a persona, it's whether we've mistaken it for our whole identity. So curiosity about ourselves is often the beginning of change.
For sure. And I think that we try to push just the curiosity. Like we want, like I always tell the kids, they always remain curious. Or people that I'm talking to in any facet of life, whether it's at work, at home, like always have a curiosity. If you maintain a curiosity about people or others or a culture or where they come
Hmm.
from, natural curiosity is going to build your empathy. It's going to build a toolbox for you that leads to emotional intelligence and stuff like that. Curiosity is such a wonderful thing to build off, whether it's scientifically speaking and you're going down that avenue or just existing as a human being in society.
Yeah.
But do you think that that pulls us into, obviously we're talking about authenticity being an important part of it, but so when we talk about faking it till you make it, then where do you think that falls into play? More on is that become more masking, or is that can that still technically be an authentic approach in adaptation?
I say fake it till you make it so often too, because I think sometimes we have to put our best foot forward, which is a little different than masking per se,
Hmm.
but putting your best foot forward and being like, okay, I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'm gonna try my best. I'm gonna give it my all. I'm gonna act like I know what I'm doing until I convince my brain that it knows what I'm doing. So I think it is different. I think you can be authentic while still doing the fake it till you make it, but maybe not 100% authentic because you are still quote unquote faking it, right? But I think it's trying to put the best version of yourself into the situation so that you succeed.
So I agree 100%. I was just curious on your perspective of it because obviously when you throw big flashy words, when you hear people hear fake it, they just, oh, it's a trigger to kind of step back and
Yeah.
like, oh no, I'm not trying to be fake. No, I'm not saying that you're being fake, but you don't know the situation. You don't know what you don't know is something that I always like to
Yeah.
put out there.
Yeah,
Walking into a
exactly.
situation, yeah, you may know some people there, but it could be just a social situation where you've never met some of the people that they know. Like this is the first time you're meeting extended friend group and things like that, or you're walking into leading a meeting at work for the first time, or you're taking the kids to this event that you've never taken the kids to before. So there's things you don't know. So even all those minor, seemingly minor things in life have this portion of it where you're kind of like going along with like, I don't know how I need to react to people or what part of me is going to fit here and how I need to adapt to the situation until you kind of just kind of go with the flow a little bit. So
Yeah.
maybe it's more of going with the flow rather than faking it. But you
So
know,
it's kind of
the
like faking comfort, but not faking your personality.
exactly. Yeah, you're allowing a display of comfort so that so others can kind of feel that safety net and kind of allow to their comfort to exert as well until you kind of meet and mesh. I think it's kind of how that works versus walking in. I don't accept. I never expect somebody to walk into a situation like, "Oh, I'm gonna be a fake person today. I'm gonna be a total psycho-sociopath and just be
Oh
here
my
to mess with
gosh.
people." You know what I mean? I mean, I'm sure
Yeah.
that happens, but that's not I don't think that that's ever what that phrase was really intended for. I think it falls more in line with you don't know what you don't know until you find out, and then you can learn about it. I think those more closely align with that than just being a fake person.
And to bring it back to Young, if Young is right that we slowly develop these ways of moving through the world, then the next question almost asks itself, how does that happen? How does behavior become automatic? How does something we do to survive eventually feel like part of who we are? And that's where I think conditioning becomes really fascinating.
For sure. And I think conditioning and habits, like we've talked about, and those things, and how repeated experiences become automatic. I think it's that learning process. And if Jung is really right that we slowly develop these variations of ourselves, then the further question is then, like you said,
Mhm.
in the same line of what you're asking is how? Like how does
Yeah.
being the funny kid or people pleaser or the perfectionist eventually stop feeling like something we do and start feeling like who we are? Like perfectly like you said, and now I'm adding more words to how does that happen? And I think conditioning really does give us that one possible.
Yeah, and conditioning is one of psychology's simplest ideas, but it's definitely one of the most powerful. Our brains are constantly asking, what happens when I do this? And if something consistently helps us feel safer, our brains remember it. And if something consistently hurts, our brains remember that too. So,
Well, yeah, because I mean, over time, the brain starts predicting instead of waiting for all the evidence, right? Like
mhm.
the efficiency factor of human existence comes into play, and you start saying, "Last time this happened, this is what kept us safe." So that behavior comes further to the forefront, and it becomes repeated behavior.
Well, I think that's why habits don't feel like decisions, they feel like shortcuts. And the brain has already decided what it thinks is safest.
Well, because I mean, that's the interesting thing, right? The brain isn't asking, "Is this making me happy?" It's asking, "Has this helped me survive before?" And those are very different goals. And if that's the constant state, like we've talked about, those neuron sheaths, those pathways of efficiency, the brain is
Hmm.
literally designed to become efficient through habit and learned
Hmm.
experience over time. That's why they're hard to break, right? It's hard to break away from those and take a different.
Yeah.
Sometimes that can be helpful, like we talked about riding a bike, right? But if you try to ride a backwards bike, all of a sudden the world is upside down and you don't want to be in the situation anymore. Like, so,
Right. Sometimes it's incredibly helpful, but sometimes that's why we keep repeating patterns that no longer serve us. So, when you first learned about conditioning, what surprised you, Brian?
but I would have to say it was like a slap in the face of like every memory I had of like different ways of learning things through childhood in the military at the same time.
Hmm.
Because that's just like pure conditioning. Obviously, they like to use the conditioning word for conditioning your body to literally survive different environments and situations. But I think how hard it is to break and how much of like talking about persona being like different, like kind of more of an experience, our reflected experience onto others in different scenarios. But conditioning really kind of makes it feel like that's where the permanency starts. If you allow
Yeah.
yourself to condition to wear the mask, for example, that's where I kind of really dove into it. You condition yourself to do that, then it's hard as hell to take off. And you're creating this deficit of healing longer and longer and longer until you kind of start having the reverse and start conditioning yourself to that healing pathway. 'Cause you
Oh
have to
my gosh.
recondition to heal.
Yes. Like that makes me think of like having been in abusive relationships and leaving those and the patterns that I had with that, and then getting into a healthy relationship and still expecting danger in a healthy relationship. And I think that's definitely an obstacle I've faced that kind of looks like what we're talking about.
Well, that's actually kind of leads into that. Have you ever, in those moments, caught yourself reacting before you had time to, before you could actually think about what you were reacting to? The brain was already boom, pulling the trigger for you.
Yes, definitely. I think that I'm still learning how to be safe in a safe relationship. And so I think sometimes my brain will hear something and it'll react automatically and think that we're in danger when I'm actually safer than I've ever been in my life. And I think that's something that I'm still navigating. I work with my therapist with that a lot. I do a lot of EMDR around these types of things, but it's definitely something I'm actively learning.
For sure. And I think, and I was also going to ask if you ever had to teach your brain something that was safe, but I will kind of answer my own question here at first, because that's something that really feel I am still heavily doing when it comes to like being kind of hyposensitive
Mhm.
to some reactions. Cause I feel that like I feel like there's still things that like, I don't know are going to kind of be that trigger factor for me to really put me into a mindset that I don't want to be in, or I get frustrated or angry about, even though it's kind of not that important in the long run. Or if there's a situation where I feel scared because I'm not right, or
Mhm.
there's just a point in time that I can't connect the situation to why it's bothering me. But then when it comes to like truly devastating circumstances or real life things that cause reaction, it's like that's almost when I finally feel like it's normalized. Like
Mhm.
I can walk through the process. And yeah, like it still sucks, but my reactions feel like 100% clicking down the line, justified, appropriate, like it. But then my brain allows me to kind of go into the mode of what do I need to do, like what do I need to take care of, like what is the healthy forward, like what needs to be done, and it's
Right.
something. This obviously this week we talked about losing the puppers was. I mean, it's tremendously devastating, but at the same time, it
I'm so
felt.
sorry for your loss.
I appreciate that. But even going through that process, it felt more me than I can't stop myself from reacting to. So because obviously, like I to say, you can't stop it. It feels like you
Yeah.
can't stop yourself in the situation, right? I'm not saying that I'm not trying to not take ownership of my reactions because
Well,
they
your
are mine,
nervous
right?
system can
Yeah.
expect something different than what you're learning to trust.
And so that was the biggest thing for me is like taking a step back, like, oh no, that hypersensitivity is still very real. Like my body is
Mhm.
still expecting to be good to go when it's serious and it is real. But then my body almost wants to push little dumb stuff to get to that point. And that's frustrating for me of like fighting that habit and that kind of reaction to make small stuff bigger so that it feels more appropriate for me to react.
Well, I think the same thing, this can apply to several different categories of things with people, like not just why people return to unhealthy relationships, but maybe why compliments can feel uncomfortable, or you might have financial beliefs that you learned in childhood that you're trying to break in adulthood. A fear of asking for help, perfectionism. You might be an eldest daughter and have eldest daughter syndrome, or maybe you were a gifted kid and that became your identity. Or maybe you do have autism and you're trying to learn social roles. And then we got to think, why do some people feel so guilty relaxing? I think all of these things definitely tie into this and are different ways that people can look at what we're talking about and maybe relate from their own lens.
Not only that, but I also want to mention just folks that go through learning social cues and rules and stuff with autism that were taught by someone that probably also has it and did never had that learning experience. So it becomes this extra steep learning curve. And I understand the frustration of like those people probably won't ever admit it. And then it also becomes very hard for you to live in that life, especially when there's still just absolute denial and frustrations going on with certain people in power and the decisions we're dealing with and fighting against in those things. So I think that the bigger problem is we had this. I don't even want to say it was like a safe place for autism to be realized and expressed because it was still always a fight. But we had this moment where it was more open and we've been able to talk about it and learn about it together, even as a society. Now it feels like there's a reversion that I have a fear is going to make this whole thing harder and make those masks fit more tight than
Yeah.
allowing people to just switch to personas like we've been talking about and build recondition themselves towards healing.
I'm definitely afraid of that happening too. And I think a lot of people in the autistic community definitely feel the way we're feeling about that as well.
Because it's repetition. Now we're reverting to an old repetition, and like we
Hmm.
just talked about, that wires expectation.
Yeah.
The brain and the brain values, predictions and efficiency. We want to be efficient in our time. We don't like wasting time, but
Hmm.
then we feel like relaxing is somehow a waste of time. But in reality, where everybody feels like, especially nowadays, is in the survival mode, and that's not what thriving or living really is.
No.
And then we kind of go into those blame assertions. And instead of recognizing just patterns, we assign blame. We just try to blame the issue on something or ourselves. And it creates this different vicious cycle of repetitious behavior built on negative repetition.
So, kind of like recognizing a learned pattern isn't about assigning the blame, it's about creating choice.
Yeah, absolutely. And accepting that you have the choice, right? Like you have to
Yeah.
first, yeah, you have to first admit that you have the ability and authority within yourself, the sovereignty of yourself to make a choice for yourself rather than just letting that survival mode take on and just be this blame.
And I think so many people can get discouraged with this. And because if these patterns have been reinforced for years, maybe decades, can they actually change or are we just stuck with the brain we've built?
That's like the age old question, though. Can people really change? I feel like there's a lot of different areas to really dive into that, right? Because if parts of our identity are learned and our brains are consistently reinforcing those patterns, then yeah, can people change? Is that a possibility?
I mean, or are we just becoming slightly different versions of the same people we've always been?
Well, like I just said, I think that's an age old question for many different avenues rather than just kind of, the core of where we're trying to bring it. But you hear people say that people never change all the time, but then you also hear anyone can change, right? There's the old adage that, if I can do better, or if that person can do better, then really anyone can change. And we have historical evidence of people that can. I know there's folks like I talked
Yeah.
about my dad, for example, on that, and having like legitimate visceral proof in the moment that people really can change and make those choices.
Hmm.
But it comes back to allowing yourself to understand you have the choice to change.
So maybe the better question isn't can people change? Maybe it's what does the change actually mean? So, like, if someone learns healthier boundaries, are they becoming someone new or are they becoming more themselves? Or say if someone stops people pleasing, did their personality change or did the fear just stop running the show? I mean, that's something we definitely need to consider.
For sure. And I think that that's also, obviously we talked about the ship of Theseus and those things, previously of when you become something new or when you don't change or do you stay the same but different, I think there's like a big philosophical point there. But when we talk fundamentally, when, maybe the growth isn't adding new personality or removing things that have been covered up, but
Well,
do
maybe
people
it, I
fundamentally
mean,
change?
maybe it is removing the things that were covering it up, you know?
That's true. Well, yeah, obviously, when we talk about, unmasking, that's a very big one. That's a very
Hmm.
direct reference to taking away the pieces that have been, covering up the trauma or blocking the roadblocks to healing in a
Hmm.
big way. So, and yeah, it's one of those weird things with personality. I don't know if that's really what changes. Or, I mean, obviously, on the outside, personality is what changes in a big way. If you're on a healing process, your personality outwardly might change. But do you think people, because they're on this healing journey, is that a fundamental change, or is it more of I don't know, even like we talked about before,
Like an
and
identity
just an
change.
acceptance? Yeah, yeah,
Like a behavior change versus an identity change? Yeah, it's definitely a controversial topic for what that looks like because I think a lot of people are like, "Well, I've changed," but they've changed their behaviors in a lot of ways. But I think in many ways we stay true to ourselves at our core. I don't know that we change necessarily our whole identity when we're talking about learning new healthy patterns or practicing safety and making different choices and things like that. But I think
I
people
think it's
can
also sorry, I think it's also hard because what we see on the outside and what people represent because you go back to persona, right? Maybe they are using that persona as a shield for their environment. It's really hard to know who someone actually is fundamentally because you don't know if you're being shown that.
Yeah, like I think an example for me is the difference between surviving and living after trauma work. Because when I was in survival mode, I was much more reactionary. I was just going off of what I knew to expect versus doing trauma work and healing work and trying to learn and practice safety, like we talked about in last week's episode. Safety is a learned, safety is something that's repeated. So I think that's something that came to me big time when I was breaking the cycle of abusive relationships or having a really first healthy relationship that's been unfamiliar, even though my nervous system expects something different.
For sure. And I think it's just like strange. Obviously, I've talked the example of like I think even as a kid or growing up, I always like saw through like all the anger, whatever, at different parts of my family and
Hmm.
saw it differently. Saw maybe obviously I want to call it the truth now that I have the evidence, but at the time I just felt like there was something different past the anger. And I've dealt with folks obviously all over the world where and they've come from all parts of the world where people were just like outwardly and openly racist, but then kind of hiding it at the same time. You know what I mean? Like you can tell people are trying to just
Hmm.
to skirt the clause there, but also then when confronting that person, being very like, what the like, why? Why do you want to do this? Why are you like why are you treating people like that? And then they come down like I don't know. It actually makes me feel bad, but like it's just what I was always taught. Like that's what my household was always like that. Like it was always like that. And I'm
Yeah,
like, okay, well like you are a racist. Like I can't take that away. Like you're gonna have that now because of your behaviors, but at the same time, you don't have to keep being that. You can
yeah. Well, I mean,
walk away and make that
I
choice, yeah.
think you can learn to accept other people. That's a behavior that you can change. I don't think that has to be ingrained into your identity forever. I think that applies to a lot of different behavior changes, like addiction recovery, even forgiveness, like the behaviors around forgiveness, criminal rehabilitation, personality versus habits a big is big. Like, I don't think they're necessarily the same thing and they're separate from each other. I think some people go through this with religious deconstruction, identity after just becoming disabled or chronically ill. That was a big one for me was I mean, I've been sick since I was a young child, but I think losing more of my abilities in my 30s and like having to start using a wheelchair, that was definitely kind of an identity crisis and like figuring out who am I with this new circumstance and then what behavior ties into that. And then I think like just aging or being a parent or midlife reinvention or midlife crisis, if you want to call it that. But I think all of those things say that change isn't always dramatic and growth often happens gradually and awareness creates the possibility of choice. So many people confuse familiarity with permanence. And I don't think the question is simply whether people change, it's how change happens.
Yeah, well, I think it comes to, I mean, you've said it before as well, as far as like healing versus changing as a human being. You know what I mean? Like who you are. It's something
Mhm.
that you have brought up before. And like, is that kind of what led you to that realization that healing isn't becoming someone else? It's actually reacting differently.
I think so. Yeah.
Well, and obviously that people, this comes with, age, maturity comes with age. It doesn't always, I can tell you that much. I've seen that. And I think that's a crazy thing of seeing that very distinctly two different pathways of choosing, understanding you have the choice to change and make changes and let things go, and a person that absolutely does not make that changes and keeps living in this blaming everybody else, blaming their situation, sticks with that blame game, and they're literally blaming other people has become a habit that they don't want to break.
Well, and I think
And
psychology gives us a really hopeful answer to all of this, though, because for a long time, scientists thought the adult brain was basically finished developing. And then that's not what we believe anymore. And I honestly think learning about neuroplasticity completely has changed the way I think about healing. And Yeah, I mean, we've spent the last few minutes asking whether people can really change. And what's fascinating is neuroscience has been asking that same exact question. For a long time, scientists believed that once you reach adulthood, your brain was basically finished. So 25, I think, is the age that a lot of people think. I've heard if you're neurodivergent, it may actually be closer to 30. But what we're understanding today is that your brain isn't finished when you hit that magical age.
Yeah,
And
there is no magical age. Yeah.
no, it's one of the most hopeful discoveries in modern neuroscience, and it's something called neuroplasticity. And it simply means that the brain can change throughout life, not overnight, not effortlessly, but it can change.
It's like every time we learn a new skill, right? We practice it to
Hmm.
make it a new habit. You're repeatedly responding differently, or your brain strengthening kind of becomes the neural pathways become stronger and the other ones kind of weaken and constantly adapting to that new experience. Obviously, I talk about the neuron sheathing a lot. Strength, the physical connection of those pathways becoming stronger.
Yeah. Let's kind of think about learning to drive. At first, everything feels overwhelming. I mean, I'm sure you remember driver's ed. That was, oh my gosh, so overwhelming.
I
Yeah,
try not to think about it.
Mr. Erickson slamming the
Yeah,
brakes
yeah.
on the yeah, yeah, that was okay. But
Or
you
being super mad because I had nothing but green lights for like an entire straightway. I had no stoplights to stop at. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but okay, so you're overwhelmed. You're constantly thinking about the mirrors, the pedals, the speed, the signs. But like years later, after you've had your license, you're driving home, you barely remember the trip. Nothing magical happened. Your brain just built stronger pathways through repetition. So I think that same principle can apply to emotional habits.
Well, yeah, because if your brain's been practicing expecting criticism for 20 years, it's gonna get very good at spotting criticisms over anything else. If you're practiced apologizing and saying sorry
Mm-hmm.
1,000 times a day when you haven't even done anything wrong, you're gonna say sorry to everything, even if, that pathway just becomes this familiar and almost safe feeling for you. It feels safer to say sorry than to step back and understand the situation.
I think the hopeful part isn't that change is easy, but the hopeful part is that your brain isn't frozen or stuck. It remains capable of adapting throughout your life. So that doesn't mean you can simply think positive. It means repeated experiences, new environments, therapy, supportive relationships, and intentional practice can gradually reshape how your brain responds. And that's very different from saying healing is quick.
That is completely different. But it also brings a new question in mind, just for you, is when you first kind of learned this whole this idea, especially when you mentioned, first it was like, oh, you're 18, you're an adult. Oh, you're not really an adult with a full brain until you're 25. Then neurodivergent. Oh, push it closer to 30. We're just making up numbers at this point. When you first learned the brain could physically change throughout all adulthood, really, it doesn't ever stop. What really surprised you? What came as the biggest surprise from that?
I could heal my trauma. And
And
that was that was huge. I could heal these behavior patterns that I've been stuck in. Like I was always getting into abusive relationships and then going back to those abusive relationships. And I think learning that I could train my brain to not want that anymore was huge. And I think that therapy played a huge part in all of that. And I think I mentioned last episode that I did something called ketamine in therapy, which builds those new neural pathways in the brain. And the existing ones are still there, but when you're making new connections, that's your brain is it's healing itself and it can take years, it can take time, but but neuroplasticity means that you're able to reconstruct those pathways in the brain and be able to think in a healthier, different, new way.
it also goes to show that they're not necessarily the old ones aren't necessarily gonna go away and just be gone
Mm-mm.
and disappear from your brain, right? You're
Right.
making the more say more positive pathways in the pathways you want to make, the habits you're trying to guide for, your healing pathways, you're making those stronger. So those become the quick fire reaction because your neurons, when they're kind of first making that bridge, like it's not as fast. And you keep making and that habit grows, and that neuron literally grows and has this stronger highway about it rather than it goes from one lane to two lane to multi-lane to a highway, basically, is kind of how it works. And that becomes your quick connection. You can jump on that connection before your maybe more negative survival reaction to every situation, like we've kind of discussed.
And I think like some things that we can look at with neuroplasticity, like why does therapy often feel repetitive? Well, it's because we're training the brain to develop those new pathways and to learn that safety. So it has to feel repetitive. That's why exposure works. Like say you've developed agoraphobia. It's something I had I've struggled with on and off in my life several times. And when I'm not leaving the house, I'm more likely to get into that. But when I'm exposing myself to the outside, it becomes easier and easier. And versus the opposite when I'm inside, it becomes easier and easier to stay inside. I think exercise and brain health, habit formation, people heal their brains through meditation. You can develop new neural pathways by learning languages and instruments, recovering from addiction. That's a huge one. The brain can heal from that. Trauma recovery as a whole, just because trauma recovery and drug addiction, a lot of the brain's affected very similarly. And so this neuroplasticity that we know about now teaches us that the brain can heal from those things. And I think that's amazing. And I think that's why consistency matters more than intensity.
But I think that's what people kind of they try not to associate, like the similarities between healing from, like you talked about, addiction and trauma and these repetitive choices is that repetition is extremely important. That's
Hmm.
why I think that's why people kind of like they knock on, like you brought up, therapy and why it feels repetitive, and that's why people they're just saying the same thing over and over again. Like, yes, there's a purpose for that. Meditation. Well, I just keep, yeah, I focus on my breathing, I focus on my heart rate relaxation over and over and over again, but it's just the same thing over and over again.
Because
Yes, you're teaching your
it's,
body. Yeah,
yeah, repetition strengthens those neural pathways.
yeah.
So,
That way,
I,
instead of taking 13 breaths and 30 minutes to meditate, eventually, when you're in a moment where you want to put your hand through a wall, you go with one or two breaths, your heart rate lowers, and then that
yeah.
pathway is now a lot quicker.
Yeah, and like you said, the old pathways don't necessarily disappear. New ones just
Oh yeah,
become
they're still there.
stronger and easier to access. And I think healing isn't about becoming a different person overnight. And it takes time. And I think hope comes from recognizing that today's automatic response doesn't have to remain tomorrow's automatic response.
What was it last time? Did they say it last week that it was like you can build towards tomorrow while also letting go of yesterday, but that doesn't mean yesterday didn't happen.
Yes.
Those the things still occurred, and that's I'm not gonna say that they're okay, but, like, it's okay for you to still step forward towards tomorrow, even if it was frustrating, you had an off day. The consistent being consistent doesn't mean that you have an off day and it breaks everything. It's like, "Hey, that happened, accept it, work through it, and then pick it back up and keep going." Your consistency can have potholes, you can step over them and get back on the track that you're trying.
Mhm.
That's okay. You haven't failed because of 1 day or 2 days or just like the gym or
Exactly.
anywhere else. Yeah.
Exactly. I think one of my favorite examples of this idea doesn't actually even come from psychology. It comes from the show BoJack Horseman, which is
Shows
funny
can be
because
psychology too.
they can, which is funny because underneath all the jokes, it's one of the most psychologically insightful shows I've ever watched, to be clear. So, but there's this scene where Bojack is struggling to run and he's like exhausted, he's discouraged, he wants to quit, and a man runs by him and tells him it gets easier. Every day it gets a little easier, but you have to do it every day. That's the hard part. So, I don't think that scene is really about running. I think it's about being human.
Well, which is interesting to come from a horseman. There's a connection. But it is. We often, expect change to feel natural just because we decided we want it. And that's big. Like just making the decision is a huge step. I don't want to take that away from anybody. But
Hmm.
learning never really works that way because that's what kind of allows us to fall into those potholes and want to stay there.
Hmm.
Whether it's learning a language or playing piano, going to therapy, setting boundaries, trusting people, it's always awkward in the beginning. There's going to be this trepidation that you want to revert back to your safety net. That's not like
Yeah.
we said. That's not evidence of failing, like we talked about. Having an off day is not failure. It's just an evidence that you are trying to build something new.
I think one thing I find comforting is that the runner doesn't say it gets easy. He says it gets easier. And that's the difference. Growth doesn't remove effort, it changes what effort feels like.
I just want to say that or repeat that specific portion. It's not that it gets easy. It gets easier.
Exactly. And growth
That's
does not
extremely.
remove effort, it changes what effort feels like.
But when they do understand the difference, when that click happens,
Mhm.
why do you think that resonates with people so well?
Well, because I think a lot of people think, well, if I do this, it's gonna be easier, it's gonna be hard. And I think this challenges that it's not always gonna be easy and it's not always gonna be hard. It can be easier. And I think that is the big difference. And a lot of people can relate to that understanding once that differentiation's been made.
Absolutely. And I think it comes back, and this is something, especially for like customer service, that I always try to teach folks above everything else is setting expectations. Because when we set expectations for others or ourselves, and then we don't meet those expectations, failure feels astronomical.
Mhm.
That's what I think helps drive that feeling of failure and makes us wanna give up on the situation or the moment. And I think really setting that aside and setting the expectation and understanding it ahead of time, even something seemingly as simple as easy versus easier is huge, because if you tell yourself it's gonna be easy in the future and it stays hard one way or another, it's it's gonna feel like a failure every step of the way. I
Well,
think
I mean,
that's the
motivation
pitfall.
comes and goes, and discipline versus identity, small habits leading to big habits. That's why New Year's resolutions can be so hard for so many people and staying committed to that kind of change. And I think progress is hard to notice while it's happening. And that's a big
Mhm.
thing that a lot of us will be like, "Oh, I'm failing, I'm failing, I'm failing," and then we look back in retrospect and we're like, "Oh, I was doing way better than I thought. I was making progress." And you gotta not compare yourself to people who are further along than you are on the journey because they've had to go through the obstacles that you're going through or a version of the obstacles you're going through. And I
So
think
in
it's just so important. Yeah.
So, like, even in that episode, was there, because I'd have to lean on you for this, but was there a reflection from Bojack to say, like, did he look for, like, did he kind of fall into that trap, or was he actually just listening to the lesson being portrayed by someone that's further along? Because I think there's a great thing you can take from you can take experience from others when the lesson is there to be learned from that. Like, hey, I am further along. Know that it gets easier. It's going to be hard, but it gets easier. Versus seeing that person who's so much farther ahead in the race than you and kinda having that envy,
I think what I remember from the shows is BoJack keeps running.
and that's a good
Yeah,
positive part of the lesson, right?
you're
Because
right.
'cause I'm sure, once again, I'm sure it wasn't perfect, or even as a horse person, you're heaving and huffing and puffing, like, but repetition needs to
Mhm,
matter more than perfection, right? That progress is gonna happen gradually.
mhm,
There's gonna be aha moments that feel great, like, don't like, those will be there, those do happen, but you need to keep that progression going, right? Like, difficulty or having, like, sudden spikes of difficulty increase doesn't mean you're incapable. It's
for
just
sure.
it's part of the process, right? So that's where that consistency mattering more than intensity, because there are gonna be moments where, like I said, the aha moments happen, or it just feels like a much harder a day, or you're gonna run into a week at a time where it just feels astronomically harder. As long as you're consistent through it and still taking even small steps, like, you're gonna get through it. Like, in time, this will pass.
Yeah,
And change should be measured. It has to be measured over a lifetime, because if you narrow it down to just moments at a time, yes, they're important, but it's gonna hold you back. So you need to look at the months and years and further down the
not the
road.
days, not the
Yeah,
days. Yeah,
absolutely.
and I think that's why I love ending this conversation with Viktor Frankl. We love him.
We do. We do.
Because after talking about the brain, habits, conditioning, and identity, he reminds us of one thing none of those ideas take away from us our ability to choose what we do next. So, we've definitely covered a lot today. We started by asking whether the person we think we are is actually the person we've always been. We've talked about how experiences shape us, how our brains build patterns, and whether those patterns can change. So, where does all that leave us?
I think the biggest thing in the conversation and what's changed for me is how I think about people, and that includes myself.
Mhm. I think it's easy to look at someone's behavior and think, why would they keep doing that? But psychology invites us to ask a different question. What problem was that behavior originally trying to solve?
And this is actually another portion that's important for me, is that I it doesn't excuse harmful behavior.
No,
It can help explain it, and understanding isn't the same thing as approving it. I think that I want to say that
definitely.
twice. Understanding does not excuse and is not the same as approving.
Absolutely. I also think it changes how we talk to ourselves. Instead of saying, "What's wrong with me?" maybe if we started asking, "What happened that taught my brain this was necessary?" And
And
maybe the most hopeful part of all of this is realizing that our brains learn these patterns so they can learn new ones. Not overnight, not without effort, but they aren't frozen, and neither are we.
absolutely. And I think now I'm going to bring back an idea for Viktor Frankl is when he wrote, between stimulus and response, there is space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. And I don't think that he's trying to portray that we have unlimited control, right? Like sometimes the space is tiny, very, very small,
Mhm.
especially after trauma, especially when overwhelmed, especially when, the old patterns are starting to kind of show up and rear themselves back.
So, but maybe healing isn't about becoming a completely different person. Maybe it's about slowly making that space a little bigger, a moment where we pause, notice what's happening, and realize I don't have to respond the way I always had.
And sometimes you don't owe the situation a response.
That's true.
There's also that as well. And maybe that's what growth really is, right? Like we said, not perfection. It's not never struggling ever again. It's just allowing yourself to understand you have more choice than you gave yourself yesterday.
And I think healing doesn't erase your past, it changes your relationship with it. Your experiences help shape you, they don't have to completely define you. And maybe that's the most hopeful thing psychology has to offer. Understanding why you became who you are isn't the end of healing, it's often the beginning.
I think that's a really great line to leave folks with and to leave ourselves with. But at the same time, I also know that even at the end of episodes, you get a little nosy. So I'm sure you'd love to hear something from our
Well,
community, if I'm not mistaken.
yeah, we'd love to hear from you on threads or in the comments of this video and podcast. But what's one belief about yourself you're beginning to question?
It's another great thing to leave everyone to think about. I think that's one of our purposes that we've really tried to drive home for this podcast. And I want to start by thanking everyone for spending another week with us here on the couch.
And if this conversation made you think of someone who would enjoy it, we'd really appreciate you sharing the episode. And if you're enjoying these conversations, subscribing is one of the best ways to help us keep making them.
With that, we'll see you next week on the Existential Couch.